Our scripture reading for today is found in John chapter 15, verses 18 through 25. If the world hates you, keep in mind that it hated me first. If you belonged to the world, it would love you as its own. As it is, you do not belong to the world, but I have chosen you out of the world. That is why the world hates you. Remember what I told you. A servant is not greater than his master. If they persecuted me, they will persecute you also. If they obeyed my teaching, they will obey yours also. They will treat you this way because of my name, for they do not know the one who sent me. If I had not come and spoken to them, they would not be guilty of sin, but now they have no excuse for their sin. Whoever hates me hates my Father as well. If I had not done among them the works no one else did, they would not be guilty of sin. As it is, they have seen, and yet they have hated both me and my Father. But this is to fulfill what is written in their law. They hated me without reason. This is the word of the Lord.
Thanks be to God.
Please be seated.
Amen. Thank you, Regina. Hey, good morning, everyone. Welcome to Hope. My name is Drew. I'm one of the pastors here, and we've actually been in this message series in the Gospel of John, which is this historical account of the person of Jesus. And really, we've been looking at this really one seminal event in the life of Jesus that actually happens right before his death, and that's basically the Lord's Supper. Now, even if you're not a Christian here, maybe you've seen images or paintings about the Lord's Supper. The significance of it is it's really the last meal that Jesus has with his disciples. So you got to imagine, like, and especially in the Gospel of John, which is again a historical account, it actually devotes 4 whole chapters to this one meal and some of the most prominent teachings of Jesus during this meal, as well as some of the actions. And so we've entitled this message series Lessons from the Lord's Supper. And one of the reasons why is because around the world, you may or may not know this, we are actually in a season of Lent. And Lent is this season that kicks off with Ash Wednesday, which was a few weeks ago, and it culminates with Holy Week. And Lent is this season where a lot of people, what they do is they give up something. For instance, they'll fast from things like red meat or sweets or something like that, so that they can intentionally focus on bringing their attention towards Jesus. So in other words, it's this way of saying, like, I'm going to give up something, and whenever I think about those things, I'm actually, instead of partaking of those things, such as sweets or whatever else it might be. So for me, it was social media. I knew that I just felt like it was too saturating my mind and my attention. So giving up that. So any impulse that I have, instead, that my mind, my heart, my attention would actually go towards Jesus. And so we thought it'd be very appropriate then to actually look at this passage or these passages in the life of Jesus that focuses on some of Jesus's most prominent teachings. Now, as we've been looking at some of these, today's passage perhaps, and maybe you're not a Christian here, you probably heard this passage and you were a little bit like taken aback, like as I was when I first read it, because here there's words, very strong language and words that are used. Check out what Jesus says to his disciples. He says, if the world hates you, like immediately, I'm like, whoa, 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 Jesus, can we just jump to what happened about love and vines and serving others? And all of a sudden, though, he jumps right in and he's like, no, no, no. If the world hates you, keep in mind that it hated me first. And now, again, a part of me is just kind of like, I feel really uncomfortable with this word hate, especially in the world today with so many hate crimes that exist. And in the translation that's used, it's this word where that again connotes this idea of misery and this being against. And so look at what it says. If you belong to the world, it would love you as its own. As it is, you do not belong to the world, but I have chosen you out of the world. That is why the world hates you. Now, notice what it says. If they persecuted me, oh my goodness, Jesus. First, we're going from hate to persecution. Are you serious? Now, Jesus is again, he's foreshadowing what's about to happen to him because this is all happening before his very death. And now he says, if they persecuted me, they will persecute you also. If they obeyed my teaching, they will obey yours also. They will treat you this way because of my name, for they do not know the one who sent me. Now, Jesus is using such stark language here about hate and persecution. Now, one of the reasons why, not only culturally, right, we have this world where even the word hate, and we think of hate crimes and anything that might be oppositional, like I know that I feel very, very uncomfortable with it. And I feel especially uncomfortable with it because I tend to be a people pleasing type of person. As the youngest of four in a family where I was constantly vying for attention. And so I'm also, if you've ever heard of this personality kind of ancient personality wisdom kind of framework called the Enneagram. I'm an Enneagram 2, which is a helper. And a helper, the vice or the shadow of a helper is basically a need to be liked. And so, what a helper does is a helper actually helps people so that you will like me. Now, so basically, so some of you are like, are you saying that you're only nice to me so that, so that you're trying to get me to like you? And I'm saying, yes. Uh, it was so humiliating hearing that because it really is. I mean, that's how I learned how to survive in the world, that I help people. And the more I can help people, then they'll like me. Now, of course, each of these different kind of in this wisdom tradition has these different vices to it. And of course, the vice of someone who wants everyone to like them is it's very hard for me to be declarative, to know what I want and what I prefer, areas that I need to grow in. And honestly, being comfortable with the reality that not everyone will like me. Because here's what I've discovered in my 45 years of existence is that as much as I try hard to get people to like me, to help as many people as I can so that they'll like me, I realize that as a human being, I can't get everyone to like me. Hi, my name is Drew, and I am I don't know, like a people pleasing aholic. And but the reality is that not everyone will like me. And as much as I might try, as much as I might wish for this to be the case, there are times when people just don't like me. They don't prefer me. Wow, Wanda, you laughed at that. That kind of hurt there. Oh my goodness. Uh, now, like that reality though, but isn't it true though, right? Especially in a place like New York City, I mean, there's millions of people here with all sorts of preferences, and in a pluralistic society, especially in a secular society with like New York, there's all sorts of people who have different viewpoints, backgrounds, perspectives, opinions, especially and even about religious faith and what really matters. And here, Jesus, I mean, one of the things that I really appreciate about what Jesus is doing is he's level setting the expectation right from the start. He's basically saying, listen, you cannot please everyone. And the way and the manner in which you live, but he really likens it to his own journey. He's basically saying, listen, there are people that will hate me and that do hate me and that will persecute me. And his own life would be a testimony to that. In fact, he would die just a few pages later, and he would die on the cross as evidence that not everyone would love him and not everyone would be called by him. And so Jesus is kind of level setting this expectation for his disciples. And he's essentially saying, hey, listen, this is the reality, is that the world will hate you just as it's hated me. It'll persecute you just as it's persecuted me. Now, here's the thing, okay? Because even with that stark language, some of you are like, well, why would it hate Jesus? Did he do something that would be incredibly spiteful or hateful? Well, before we kind of get into what are the reasons why people would hate Jesus, and why does he and then say like, "Hey, listen, people are going to hate you too." Before any of that, I mean, here's one of the realities. Jesus is basically talking about the manner in which he exists in the world. Right? There's a way in which he is not. Uh, He's not form fitting to the ways that everyone might expect of him. He's not out to people please for anyone. He's actually living according to a certain kind of core integrity that will require the reality that people may not like him. And there's something about that. There's something about Jesus's willingness and his passion and his commitment to his own core integrity that he's going to live a certain way that he acknowledges right from the start. Not everyone's going to love me. In fact, people might hate me. And as I was thinking about what is the reality of what Jesus is basically doing and saying, he's not out to people please. He's actually living out of a core integrity out of who he is. And I thought this was the phrase. It's that Jesus is different. Now, here's the thing. This idea, and you've probably heard this before in common culture today. I've heard young people tell me, well, it's because my son, he's in middle school, so he tells me all the cool things, right? And there's this phrase, right? Like, oh, we say about certain people, like, oh, that person, that guy is different. or that woman, she's different. And there's something about saying that person is different. LeBron James, as a basketball player, he's different. Kendrick Lamar, he's different. Taylor Swift, she's different. Well, right? Like there's all sorts of phrases that we use about people who can somehow be unique in their own way. And in many ways, as Jesus is sharing this, he's sharing this not as someone who's a kind of someone who blends in with the crowd, but someone who actually lives into a very unique kind of destiny. In other words, Jesus, he different. High five your neighbor and say, Jesus is different. Now, he's using this language of as hate though and persecute, right? And so some of us might be like, "Oh my goodness, is that what Jesus came to do? Did he come to build a movement of hate? Is that what Jesus is about? Is that why he's different? Is that what you're going to tell me?" Because honestly, in popular culture today, many people might say that's what Christians are known for their judgmentalism, their hypocrisy. Is that why Jesus is different? Well, let's kind of review where we've been, especially in the life of Jesus, especially leading up to this statement about, listen, the world might hate you just as it's hated me, and it's going to persecute you just as it's persecuted me. Let's do a little review. Where have we been as Jesus has been teaching about what makes him different? And what are the ways in which he's encouraging the people that follow him to be different? Check this out. In John chapter 13, remember at the start of the Lord's Supper, there's this moment where Jesus basically he's talking about how the ways of the world. It starts by saying that Jesus is about to show the full extent of his love, and he does this, and he does something so different than the ways of the world, because the ways of the world are all about power over. About if you ascend in your career, then you treat those behind you or those under you demeaningly, or they work for you. Right? And isn't that the way of New York? We want to ascend in power and money and significance. And when we do, then I get this title. I get that apartment. I get this job. I get this thing, this update that I can make to my LinkedIn profile or whatever else it might be. All these ways in which our status, we build ourselves. And as a result, when I build myself, then I can look down on other people. I mean, isn't that the dream of New York? To be in a position of power. And yet, you know what Jesus does? He's the most powerful person in the room. This is what Christians believe. Most powerful person in the room. He's shown that he has miracles. He can open the eyes of the blind. He can speak with tremendous authority. He can raise the dead. I mean, could you imagine the power that Jesus possesses? And in this story, at the start of the Last Supper, what does he do? He wraps a towel around his waist. He gets on his knees and he begins to wash the feet of his disciples. That's different. Could you imagine like a CEO of a company or someone with great clout and wealth and or someone who's just really well respected to actually be the person who, you know what, they're going to get on their hands and knees and do the dirtiest and most menial of tasks. And yet that's what Jesus does. He takes the posture of a servant. That's different. He talks about a different home. He talks about there's my Father's house, there are many rooms, and he talks about this other place that he goes to prepare a home for. And in so doing, what he introduces to this Christian ethic and to this belief about who we are is that, yes, we're called to be a different people, that this earth is not our true home. Now, this doesn't mean that we hate this place. In fact, we're called to love it and to serve it. But instead, we realize that we're not tethered to this place, this material world on earth, but that there is a world, a kingdom coming that is people, place, and God's presence that we live for ultimately. Now, Jesus teaches that teaching of a different home because what he's talking about, why does he talk about like this is not our true home? He speaks specifically to people who are in suffering. Now, and that's where it's so different for us, especially in a city like New York, where this is one of the wealthiest cities in the entire world. Now, I recognize that there's a mass disparity of people who come from various different backgrounds, socioeconomic backgrounds, in our church community and in our city. But Jesus is specifically talking about how this is not our true home to people who will encounter suffering. Now, why does Jesus do that? Because Jesus is trying to give a vision for the future a kind of hope that especially people who are undergoing persecution and difficulty, they can trust that there will come a day and there is a place that God is preparing. And so Jesus gives this teaching about a different home, that we live according to a different home and that place of safety. And what we're called to do, and this is why in the Lord's Prayer, it says, on earth as it is in heaven, that the prayer of the Christian is, yes, we believe that we have this different home, but we're to be a people who, when it comes to the way that we inhabit the world, the way that we do marriage, the way that we do singleness, the way that we do friendship, the way that we do generosity, the way that we do integrity, um, that in all of these different ways, we're a people who live as if there's a different home. And that home is defined by a God of kindness and truth and beauty, or a different spirit. Jesus teaches about being dependent on the Holy Spirit, being a people instead of being so self absorbed and so puffed up and so self reliant, which I know in New York City, those are tremendous values, right? To be so self sufficient that you can do things on your own. And yet here Jesus is and saying, like, listen, what it means to follow me is to be dependent on a spirit, on a power and a force much greater and more beautiful. And this power and force is a power and force that will convict us, that will remind us that we're not perfect, and that will help us to live in humility, but also to live in power. And so there's a different spirit that Jesus is talking about. And in addition to that, last week we talked about a different vine, that we're people that remain tethered to the vine, to the true vine. And this vine is one in which we find our source of life, that we don't have to find it in relationships or in all of these other places, our career, our future, in CNN or Fox News or any of these other places. Some of you are like, those are definitely not places where I find my vine, you know? But I mean, the thing about Jesus is he invites us to actually be reliant on a different vine, to have a different kind of life source. Now, these are the things that Jesus, up to this point, when he's talking about, when he brings up this teaching about, hey, the world's going to hate me and it's going to hate you too. He's talking about a different way of living in the world. Now, notice then, of all these things, Jesus is not saying, like, hey, listen, the reason why I'm different and the reason why you're going to be hated is because of how judgmental you are or how hypocritical you are. In fact, those were the things that Jesus himself would decry. In fact, that's what he came to upend. He came to actually show a different way of life that would not be judgmental and hypocritical. In fact, that he would be someone who goes against the grain in how he lives. Now, not only is Jesus different, though, but look at the passage. Look at what it says. It says, if the world hates you, keep in mind that it hated me first. If you belong to the world, it would love you as its own. As it is, you do not belong to the world, but I have chosen you out of the world. Now, he's saying this to his closest followers. He's basically saying, listen, it's not only about me being different, but look, this is why the world hates you. Now, when I read that, I'm like, Jesus, listen, I'm okay with it hating you. Does it have to hate me too? Enneagram 2, I want people to like me, please. And he says, if they persecuted me, they will persecute you also. Oh, snap. If they obey my teaching, they will obey yours also. Okay, that's a little bit more palatable. They will treat you this way because of my name, for they do not know the one who sent me. Now, do you see how interchangeable this is, right? Because here Jesus is, and he's talked about being dependent on the Spirit, and he's talked about being tethered to the vine, the true vine, and that apart from this vine, you can do nothing. You and I can do nothing. And as he's teaching his followers, here he is, and really the prominent teaching of this is Jesus is different. But not only is Jesus different, but as he talks about how a people who are dependent on him and who are tethered to him as a vine, as branches are to a vine, he basically is saying, guess what? It's not only that Jesus is different, but you're called to be different too. High five your neighbor and say, you're called to be different. Now, some of you who are artists, you're like, yes, that's right. I'm called to be different. Others of you who are in finance, you're like, I'm not, no, I'm just kidding. Just messing. Sorry, that was such an easy caricature, guys. Sorry, that was. What am I thinking? Uh, whatever vocation, whatever stage of life you're in. Notice what Jesus is saying. He's talking about each one of us, if we follow him, whatever vocation, station of life, age, that we're also called to be different. Now, what does that look like? Because here Jesus is basically saying, listen, if they hate me, they're going to hate you also. If they persecute me, they're going to persecute you also. If they obey me, it's because you're obeying me as well, and they're going to listen to you. Now, Jesus is basically saying all these things to his followers because he's inviting his closest followers that if you remain dependent on me and if you remain close to the vine, then you're going to be different too. But notice the teachings of Jesus are so profound, and you can't take this passage about hate and him being hated and him being persecuted apart from his other teachings where he would talk about what is it exactly in his vision for life, in Jesus' vision for life, that he actually presents to his followers that he's been teaching them. What exactly does that vision look like? Well, check this out. The Sermon on the Mount, Matthew chapter 5. Look at what Jesus would teach about how he is calling his followers to be different. Look at this. He says, you have heard that it was said, love your neighbor and hate your enemy. I mean, isn't that the way of the world today? Yeah, love your neighbor and hate your enemy. But I tell you this, love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you, that you may be children of your Father in heaven. He causes his sun to rise on the evil and the good, and sends rain on the righteous and the unrighteous. If you love those who love you, what reward will you get? I mean, he asks this question. Isn't it like that's one of the most natural things, just to love those who love you, to love those who are closest to you, to be devoted to the people in whatever it might be, your family, your ethnic origin, your neighborhood, anyone that you would consider not to be your enemy or adversary. It's so natural. Even, right? Even like Jesus would say later, even the pagans do that, right? Anyone naturally will only love the people that they naturally would love. But here he's talking about a very different ethic. Um, he says, are not even the tax collectors doing that? And if you greet only your own people, what are you doing more than others? Do not even pagans do that? Here, Jesus is basically saying, like, I'm calling you to a different kind of ethic. Like, do you see the moral vision of Jesus is so different than the ways of the world? There are so, like, in today's world, it is so divided. It is crazy in the world today. You don't even have to be a Christian to acknowledge this. The strife that exists, the racial tension, the gender tension, the tension between religious groups, between nations. This world is full of all sorts of strife. And isn't it interesting that Jesus, though, he presents this moral vision, and he presented this moral vision thousands of years ago. There have been so many advancements in all these different ways, technology, medical advance. I'm just thinking about all the advancements that exist. And yet this moral vision of Jesus remains as compelling as ever, doesn't it? A vision to actually love one's enemies, to be a healing kind of community. Now, in the world around us, Jesus is offering, like, this is how you're called to be different. The reason why the world might hate you is because you're supposed to be someone who's like a bridge builder. You're supposed to be someone who emanates with love for enemies. See, that's not the ways of the world. And isn't it stunning? See, now the earliest followers of Jesus, they understood this. Now, the earliest followers of Jesus, could you imagine? So Peter's sitting there. The disciples are sitting, listening to Jesus. And he's like, listen, the world's going to hate you. And the world might persecute you. Now, Peter is one of the disciples. He's listening to this. All the disciples are listening to Jesus teach about these dynamics of how we're called to be different. Now, check out what Peter would write to the early church that was being persecuted for their faith. You got to understand this Christian movement thing, the teachings of Jesus, this was new and explosive. And as the church begins to grow, people are being persecuted because people are talking about this different moral vision. And it's a moral vision that's authored by this person named Jesus, who's this no-name carpenter. And yet these disciples are armed with this message of incredible love and forgiveness. And look at what Peter ends up writing to churches that are persecuted. Look what he writes. He says, even if you should suffer for what is right, you are blessed. Do not fear their threats. Do not be frightened, but in your hearts revere Christ as Lord. Always be prepared to give an answer to everyone who asks you to give the reason for the hope that you have. But do this with judgmentalism and harshness and meanness and proving to everyone how you're right. And they need to learn and listen to the Bible. No, 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 no. He says, do this with gentleness and respect. High five your neighbor and say, gentleness and respect. Oh, wait, really? Like, the scriptures say that? Like, that's who Christians are called to be? That even when they're being persecuted, even when, if people might disagree with them, even if people might not hold their beliefs, their ethical vision for the country, even if people might, like, you're telling me that Jesus is basically saying and taught his disciples to love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you? And Peter, one of the founders of the Christian movement, would teach, be prepared to give an answer for the hope that you have, but do it with gentleness and respect, keeping a clear conscience so that those who speak maliciously about you against your good behavior in Christ may be ashamed of their slander, for it is better if it is God's will, instead of actually winning to get people to believe the same things you believe, or to get people to vote the same way you vote, or to get people to acknowledge that your way is better. He says it's actually better to suffer for doing good than for doing evil. Huh, that's different. It's different. This is gonna sound, I don't know why this example just came to mind, and, but this, like, I think of the ways of the world and how the church is called to be different. And, I remember when we first started our first church in Astoria, Queens in 2012, and we had this amazing venue, and, we felt like God really gifted us with this venue to meet in, and the original church still meets there, Hope Astoria. And it's this nonprofit organization that does incredible work with, teens, and has a tremendous record of having disadvantaged teens get into some of the finest kind of colleges and universities around the country. And so we developed this amazing partnership. We're helping serve their youth and things like that. And we started this church, and the church steadily began to grow and things like that. And then we found out that there was another church that was actually starting in the same neighborhood. And the pastor asked if they could meet with me, so I meet with this pastor, and we're talking and stuff. And, as we're talking, then, they basically tell me they're looking for a venue. And so they're looking for a venue, and so my immediate thought is like, "We've got this amazing venue, and we could kind of share the venue. You can meet at a different time and stuff like that." And I remember, meeting with some of our leaders at the time, and I was like, "Hey, guys, I'm thinking this new church that's starting, I'm thinking we could just share, like, I should introduce them to the nonprofit. It's a win-win for this church and nonprofit and all this stuff." And I remember our leaders at the time, and this is no shade on them, guys, and no, like, but our leaders at the time were like, "Oh, we can't do that. Like, that's weird. Like, a different church being using this venue as well?" And, I just remember being like, "Oh, I mean, we're meeting at different times, like, what's," and it was like, "Yeah, but, yeah, I mean, it's weird, like, this is our space, like, this is," like, and, as I look back, I'm like, "Oh my g," like, here we're starting this church in the name of trying to be different, and yet the same kind of competitive instincts when it comes to other churches, like, was starting to inform our decision making, and it was just one of those moments, and so we ended up offering for them to use the venue, so just so you know. Like, some of you guys are like, "So what did you do?" And, but it was one of those moments of like, "Oh my gosh," like, here we are, We're called to be different, and we're still co-opted by the same values, the same competitive instincts, same like it's like, what are we doing here? I mean, what a small little example. Jesus actually says, love your enemies. Pray for those who persecute you. Here I was like, oh, we're being persecuted. Another church wants to use our space. And it's like, seriously? Um, seriously? Gosh, what an affront. And here, the moral vision of the early church to be so distinct in the ways that it would function in the world. Pastor Walt from our Midtown location a few weeks ago, he was sharing at our Midtown church about this one article he read about a well-known pastor um, f- uh, who had committed a moral failure, and there was an article that was written about this pastor. And in the article, the person who was writing, who was not a Christian, but this person was so well known that it made broader media. And the person that was making this observation about this pastor said, if if I'm gonna follow some sort of religion, I would actually want the people that represent that religion to actually be different than uh, than the world that we're part of. And he was talking about how this pastor was so much like the world, and in some ways, that was what made that person such a draw. And in the article, the person basically wrote, but I would like to think that if I'm going to follow something like a spiritual guide or a religious thing, I'd want the person hopefully to just have a different manner of living. That instead of being more like the world, that they would be different than the world. Now, here's what's interesting, right? Because Peter gives this vision, like having sat in the Lord's Supper, like this vision of loving people, even those who are different, and in fact, even at his own expense, at the expense of the very church, to be a people who actually is loving and is kind to other people, including his enemies. But what's so interesting about Peter and the vision for who the church should be called to be, look at what he writes earlier in that same letter to churches that are being persecuted in Asia Minor. He writes, just as he who called you, that's Jesus, is holy, so be holy in all you do, for it is written, be holy because I am holy. Now, isn't that interesting? Because on one hand, Peter is talking about a vision for the early church and a vision for us to actually live out the different nature of the way of Jesus and to do so with incredible love. But he also invites followers of Jesus to be holy. Now, I realize for some of us who maybe you don't come from a religious background, you're just like, oh my goodness, that word holy. What are you trying to pull on us, Drew? Well, here's what holy basically means. Holy basically means to be set apart or to be different. And what Peter is basically saying is like, listen, Jesus called his followers to be distinct in their love, but also distinct in the way they live their lives, to be holy, to be set apart. And that distinctness about the way they're called to be different was this word for holiness is a word for being set apart for God, to live in a different manner, to not follow the same whims of culture and that secular society, but to actually be governed and shaped by a different spirit and a different vine. And when Peter is basically saying, be holy as I am holy, he's talking about a certain fabric of character, that the way that we live our lives. Now, throughout the history of the church, Christian theologians have wrestled with how do Christians engage the culture around us? Are we supposed to be people who look more like the world? Or are we supposed to be people who are different? Now, two seminal texts that I wanted to point you to is there's this book by Richard Niebuhr first called Christ and Culture. And both of these books were actually written in the 20th century. And Christ and Culture, Richard Niebuhr was a theologian who wrote about how in the history of the church, there are different ways that the church has approached culture. And so Niebuhr actually outlines 5 different ways that historically the church has approached culture. There's Christ of culture. So there's Christ above culture. There's Christ against culture. There's Christ and culture in paradox. And then there's Christ transforming culture. Now, he talks about how in the history of the church, there's been all sorts of different approaches as it relates to how we go about engaging with the culture around us. Now, another book that was written is a book by a British kind of missionary who was actually a missionary, again, in the 20th century to India. And as a missionary in India, he actually wrote this book called Foolishness to the Greeks. Now, this phrase, foolishness to the Greeks, comes from Paul's letter to the church in Corinth, where he talks about how the gospel, when we're actually living out the good news of Jesus, then it's foolishness to the Greeks, and it's confounding to the Jews. And basically what he's saying is, if we truly follow Jesus, we will be different. That's essentially what he's saying. Now, Newbegin, in his book Foolishness to the Greeks, he talks about how what should mark the church then, especially in a culture that is pluralistic and secular and different than perhaps the ones that Christians might believe in, is that we are called to be a countercultural community. And ultimately, this idea of a countercultural community, as Newbegin writes, is this invitation for us to be different. Now, essentially, here's what Newbegin writes, and here's what Peter is writing about, and here's what the history of the church has continued to encourage and invite each one of us into. Here it is. It's holiness, that is integrity, and it's love, it's generosity. The timeless call of the church is both. Is holiness, being different in our integrity, in the fabric of how we live our lives, as well as our love, our generosity. And the reason why, hopefully, people will hate us and maybe not agree with us and maybe persecute us is there's something about those Christians, the way they live our lives in holiness and integrity, the way they value things, truthfulness, and living their lives, and how they use their bodies and how they use their money. It's different. But those same Christians who are so different in the way they live their life, they tend to be so generous, so loving to people from different faiths, different backgrounds. They care for the needs of the poor and the marginalized. And what Newbegin writes about is how, especially in a non-Christian context, whether it's post-Christian or secular, what would it look like for us to be a countercultural community that lived into the way of Jesus, that was holy in our integrity and the way that we lived our lives and what we believe in and that sort of thing? But we're so holy, but yet we at the same time are so loving. Now, isn't that the life of Jesus? Jesus is someone who is so holy, so other, so set apart, so truthful in the way that he uses his words, his body. And yet, he's known as a friend of sinners. People see Jesus and they're like, this guy. The religious people are so annoyed with him. In fact, the religious leaders who were the ones who would lead in their hate and persecution of Jesus. Now, none of us can be perfect at this, except Jeff Trong. I'm just kidding, Jeff. But what a vision for life. I mean, could you imagine? What if the church was known? What if our church? What if Hope Church was known? Like those people, they're so different. Not in how they're excelling in all the ways of in their industries and work and whatever. And hopefully we're doing that too. But like they're so different in how they live their lives with a certain kind of integrity, kindness, honoring of people. That when it comes to, I just put two things that I just put up here were sex and money. Like when it comes to in our sex saturated world, like first for married couples, that the way that married couples do sex and intimacy it's in such a beautiful, flourishing way. And there's a vision for marriages that are faithful and passionate. And for single people, when it comes to how they do sex, intimacy, and community, and how they live with this vision for sex in their proper boundaries, but living with a vision for community and friendship. It's just different than the ways that our sex saturated culture in the world lives. Or when it comes to money, like, oh my goodness, those Christians, gosh, I sure don't believe what they believe. But man, they are so stinking generous. They're so generous that they give towards causes that I would think that they don't necessarily agree with, but these causes are causes that serve hurting people in the city. They're just different. When everyone around us, especially with the economy, like, everyone's self-protective, and man, those Christians they're just so different. They live and they give because they're different. What a vision. What an invitation. And what would it look like for you and for me to embody this vision for holiness and generosity and love? I'll be the first to admit I am not perfect at any of this. But thankfully, the message of the Christian faith has never been about me or a Hope Church. It's always been about a person. And see, Jesus, who it wasn't just what he taught, it was what he embodied. He embodied it. Like, it wasn't just words on a page, it's who he was. And in the most seminal moment in his life, look at what Jesus does when he is being persecuted and he's dying on a cross. A sign of hate and him absorbing the hate and persecution of the world. Like, he's dying on a cross. And look at what he says when he's dying on a cross. He's dying on a cross, absorbing hate and pain, being crushed. And what he says on a cross is, oh man, one day all these Christians are going to get you back for killing me. Ah man, I can't wait till I show you after I've resurrected. You guys think you think you know better, think you're better than me. I can't wait. The Christians getting power. No, he doesn't say that. Here's what he says. If we could put that image up. He says, Father, forgive them. For they don't know what they're doing. That's different. The most justified Holy One, who has every right to be vindictive, and overbearing, dies on a cross, bears our sin and shame, and says, forgive them. It's amazing, these images throughout the world. There's an image by a Congolese artist here on the top right, and a Latin American artist in the bottom right, and then a Spanish painter in the top left, and then a Chinese image of the crucifixion in the bottom left. And what's interesting about the worldwide faith that we follow, and that today, of all the places that we could be in the world and even in the city, we come today and we say the reason why we're here is because we want to say, I want to worship a God who is different. And Jesus is not different just because of his power. What's most different about Jesus is not his power. Because anyone, even people not of faith, if they were to conceive of a God, they would conceive of a God of great power, wouldn't they? But what makes Jesus different is not his great power, it's his great love. And this is our God. And one of the beautiful things about this call to be different is he doesn't call us to do this on our own strength or to do this because somehow we're superhuman. He calls us to do this by first falling in love with this God and saying, God, I realize that your way is different. And of all the trends and ideologies and religious systems and cultural kind of fads that might exist in the world, instead of following these, I want to follow the God who hangs on a cross and says, Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do. What a moral vision. What a different vision.